The Shenyang J-8B is an upgraded model of an earlier Chinese interceptor. Let's check it out. The story of the original J-8 interceptor is long, interesting, and complicated. However, I'm going to save that for another time, because I'm holding out hope that we might eventually get the original J-8 added to War Thunder at some point. The J-8B, also known as the J-8-2, that's Roman numeral 2, was a modernized design which represented a significant departure from the original. Much of the plane was completely redesigned, including the most obvious visual difference of the nose section being reworked from a shock cone intake to the more modern side-mounted intake layout, which made room in the nose for more capable radar systems. One thing that Chinese aviation engineers have proved uniquely good at has been adapting foreign designs to meet their own domestic needs. Some critics have mocked this, suggesting that the Chinese copied foreign designs because they lacked their own engineering skill, but I think the reverse is true, and the practice demonstrated a calculated pragmatism of using what worked and refining what didn't. To that end, the J-8B incorporates the wing design of the MiG-21, the air intakes of the MiG-23, which were themselves copied from the F-4 Phantom, a modified tail structure from the MiG-19, which has been scaled up a bit, and a lower vertical stabilizer also taken from the MiG-23. The result is a fighter with exceptional capabilities, which represented a significant leap in performance over other aircraft in the Chinese inventory when it was first introduced in the early 1990s. The aircraft carries the Chinese-designed Type 208A radar system and the Type 483 data link, which provided a ground-controlled autopilot to vector the plane in for intercepting targets at longer ranges than its own radar could detect. The J-8B was involved in a somewhat well-known mid-air collision with an American P-3 Orion in 2001, which caused a bit of an international incident at the time. What we get in War Thunder is the J-8B, which is currently at the end of the Chinese tech tree and rank 7 at BR 11.3. This version of the J-8 carries the Type 208A radar set, which is pretty basic and lacks most of the advanced features you might expect on a fighter at this battle rating. It has an IFF, BVR mode, and a few range and angle presets, as well as the ACM boresight mode. Critically, this is not a look-down, shoot-down radar set, which puts the plane at a bit of a disadvantage in top-tier matches. In real life, it carried the HK-03 targeting system, which adjusted the gun sight on the HUD for bomb targeting, similar to a CCIP, but in War Thunder, there's no ballistics computer of any kind. Another note, the J-8B was produced in 2 production batches with different radar sets. What we have in the game seems to represent the first batch with the original lower-powered radar. So another awkward note about weapon loadouts. As of making this video, I have confirmation from the developers that these loadouts are just a placeholder, since the customized loadout system will be coming soon, and the J-8B will be one of the first planes to get it. So if you're watching this later, your loadouts won't be quite as limited to what I have access to here. But with that said, the J-8B can carry 500-pound bombs, unguided rocket pods, and some air-to-air missiles. Unfortunately, the PL-8 missile got cut, at least for now, out of power creep concerns, but when more modern missiles eventually get added into the game, hopefully they don't forget about the J-8. The first missile that the plane does get is the PL-5B, which is a rear aspect IR missile with 20 Gs of pull and pretty respectable range. The PL-5B can slave to your radar set, making off-boresight targeting a little bit easier sometimes, but its performance is a little quirky. I have the best luck using this missile around 2 or 3 kilometers from the target. The second missile is the Aspide-1A. This is a semi-active radar homing missile with good range, 35G maneuvering, and an adequate warhead. In real life, the Alenia Aspide uses an inverse monopulse seeker similar to the Skyflash missile, and is highly resistant to glint and countermeasures, but it's really not clear if this is reflected in-game. In practice, the simplistic radar set ends up holding the Aspide back a bit, and the difficulty in maintaining a solid radar lock can prevent you from using this missile to its full potential. But on its own, this is a very capable weapon. Now, the J-8B's flight performance is simply quite strong. The plane has generous engine power, effective controls, strong climb performance, and above-average maneuverability. An upgraded pilot is going to be basically required, and this plane slips into high-G turns with zero effort. I was honestly surprised by the maneuverability, since this is currently one of the largest fighters in the game, and I expected the Snail to cripple its flight envelope, but they ended up giving it decent performance. Now, since this is a delta-winged fighter, it can tend to bleed off energy in sustained turns, but its surplus engine power mitigates that somewhat, and I really didn't run into too many problems regaining lost speed after maneuvers. In fact, if you leave the afterburner on in level flight, you're going to be up against the red line constantly, and on the larger EC maps, I found myself toggling the afterburner on and off every 20 seconds or so to avoid ripping my wings off while still maintaining supersonic speeds. As a special note here, when you take off, don't pull up too aggressively as you're leaving the runway. It's possible to get tail strikes on takeoff with this one, so be gentle for the first couple of seconds. Flying the J-8B into missions can be a little strange at first. You have access to some really high-performance semi-active radar missiles, but without a look-down radar set, it can be difficult to use them effectively. The Type 208A radar seems to have trouble maintaining locks through chaff, so that's a problem. I had the most success flying the J-8B at lower levels and basically just relying on the PL-5B missiles. Going out as a dogfighter was surprisingly fun with this plane, and the PL-5 ends up being pretty capable. The ACM boresight mode on the radar does help a bit with short-range radar locks, and since the missile can slave to the radar set, targeting is a little easier. Since you only need to maintain the radar lock for a few seconds for IR missile slaving, the flakiness of the radar set really isn't much of a handicap for this purpose. Now, one advantage of the J-8B definitely is its high speed. This plane accelerates quickly and can maintain supersonic speeds at any altitude for prolonged periods, so you can get around the battlefield very quickly. On the larger EC maps, I found that this plane was very effective as an interceptor, and when one of my buddies got into trouble like 20 kilometers away or something, it didn't take me long to get over there and help. Now, another note on that. On the EC maps, the radar and Aspide combo can be a bit more useful. The AI objective aircraft usually don't evade semi-active radar missiles very well, and they're usually at higher altitudes, so maintaining the lock isn't as difficult. If you're playing the objectives instead of going for PvP kills, it's worth thinking about your loadout before spawning in. Now, one thing I can't recommend with the J-8B is close air support. I tried a few times, but the bombs are just too inaccurate at high speeds, and the rocket pods have very limited ammo, poor accuracy, and they don't hit very hard. Without a ballistics computer, I just don't see any close air support potential here. If you fly around in ground RB, you'll be up as a fighter to swat helicopters and stuff, not to burst tanks. Visually, the J-8B... Okay, the elephant in the room. You have probably noticed by now from the footage that the elevators are backwards. They pitch in the wrong direction relative to control inputs. I let the devs know several times, but we'll see if it gets fixed. Anyway, this plane only has one paint job, and as an interesting note, the nose number is the same as the plane that got involved in that mid-air collision incident I mentioned a few minutes ago. Kinda morbid, but otherwise I think it's a great-looking aircraft. Also, it's enormous, and the first time you see it on the runway next to other planes up close, you might be a little surprised. Well, landing this plane isn't too complicated, which I'll admit was nice to see considering how huge it is. You can drop gear and flaps safely around 400 kilometers an hour, and the air brakes are pretty effective, and plus you get a drag chute. The only real caveat is to watch for tail strikes and to try and maintain a somewhat flat landing profile. The cockpit of the J-8B is also pretty good. You get a huge radar scope, great visibility all around, and a useful heads-up display. And most of the instruments are pretty easy to find once you get, your feel for the cockpit. My only real gripe is the lack of a visible radar warning receiver. Otherwise, this one was a joy to fly out in VR. To close out on the Shenyang J-8B, this plane has a healthy supply of surplus engine power, good air-to-air missiles, and it maneuvers very well for such a large plane. However, its radar set isn't great, and it doesn't have a ballistics computer. The final verdict on the J-8B is that this plane's underperforming radar set holds it back in the current fighter meta, and it has almost no potential for close air support. Even still, this is a very fun plane with lots of raw power. When the custom loadout functionality is added, this one might get a bit more utility value by mixing its missile types, so keep an eye out for that. As always, thanks for watching.